Hello and welcome to this third video in our lecture on remote user authentication. In this and upcoming videos, we're going to develop step-by-step an authentication protocol for remote authentication. And we're going to study the weaknesses at each step of the process and then try to propose solutions to these problems. So in this first slide, we're going to assume that Alice is trying to authenticate herself to Bob. And we propose the very simple three-message protocol by which Alice sends her identifier, then Bob responds by asking her to prove that she is who she says she is, and then she sends her password to Bob. So you should remember that in the context of access control, this is the first step called identification, similar to typing in your user ID. And this is the second step, namely verification, where you're proving that you are who you say you are. So what are the problems with this simple protocol? Well, one of the problems that we're going to deal with in this lecture is the fact that an attacker, Trudy, could easily perform an attack called a replay attack. So notice that with this protocol, every time Alice wants to authenticate herself to Bob using this protocol, she will actually send the same messages to Bob. In fact, this complete interaction between Alice and Bob will be identical every single time that Alice wants to authenticate to Bob. And so what that means is if the intruder is capable of capturing the two messages that Alice sent to Bob, then nothing prevents her later on, Trudy that is, to impersonate Alice and just go through that exact same protocol. And if this protocol works for Alice, then it will also work for Trudy pretending to be Alice. So this is called a replay attack because the attacker is simply replaying messages that they recorded earlier. So that's one problem that we're going to have to deal with in this lecture. And that's a very common problem for remote user authentication. Then, of course, a second problem with this protocol is that the password, as described here, is sent in the clear. So with this protocol, Alice cannot keep her password secret. Then there is the issue of efficiency, which is that why use three messages when we could first combine Alice's messages into one message and therefore not and therefore removing the need for any messages going from Bob to Alice. So when we talk about efficiency, we mean, for example, reducing the number of messages between the two parties. Now, obviously, this is not a security concern, so this is not something that's going to be of the utmost importance for us. But we should still keep in mind that we should try to minimize the number of messages that are sent back and forth. And then finally, another weakness, quote unquote, of this protocol is that for this protocol to work, Bob must know Alice's password in order to authenticate her, because he must be able to compare what Alice sent him to that password that he already knows. Okay, so this is our first attempt. Clearly, this protocol is not secure at all. So let's try another version where we're going to use hashing. So notice the only difference in this version of the protocol is that Alice is hashing her password before she sends it to Bob. So how does this affect the four problems that we discussed earlier? Well, first of all, this hashing does not prevent the attacker to perform a replay attack. There's nothing that prevents Trudy from capturing this interaction, at least the two messages from Alice, and then replaying those later. All she has to do is capture, the identifier and the hash code of the password and just replay them later. One advantage, that is really the main and only improvement of this technique, is that now the password is not sent in the clear anymore. So at least the attacker is not able to read and capture the Alice's password, just the hash of it. And since the hash function is a one-way function, the attacker cannot recover the password based on the hash code. course, in terms of efficiency, this has the same problem as the previous version, but we could also solve it by combining those two messages and then removing the need for Bob's message. And so regarding the knowledge that Bob has, in this version of the protocol, Bob must still know the hash code of the user's password. So the password who's authenticating themselves to Bob must have already shared that hash code with Bob. Now notice that's pretty common. This is the same situation where we use password-based authentication. And basically, this side of the communication had to have a stored password file. So this concludes initial discussion of a very simple protocol for remote user authentication. This protocol is definitely not acceptable. It's not secure. And the main problem is that the attacker can perform a replay attack on it.